Pecan Chi, Lillian's Consequences, second edition by Anne M. Arsenault. Original edition was Pecan Chi. Copyright 2025, Analytical Animation LLC. Library of Congress Control Number 202-592-1046. For My Family with Love. This book is a work of fiction which alludes to and loosely features moments in history and the culture of Louisiana. It is not to be taken as literal or as a historical reference or guide to historical facts. Some dates and or details have been distorted for the progression of the story. This work is for entertainment purposes only. Chapter 1, Pecan Grove. He was on a mission and determined to make it happen. Louis Blache, a French Creole and owner of the Blache Pecan Grove and Plantation, visited a longtime friend of his family that his parents knew back in France. This friend, Pierre Matisse Thureau, French European, was a saloon owner who housed and employed prostitutes in New Orleans. Pierre also owned and ran a family plantation several miles outside of New Orleans, where his white family lived. His cottage in New Orleans' French Quarter was shared by him and his black Creole family. It was commonplace to have had two families, one matrimonially celebrated between a white man and his white wife, while the other one was called a plaçage, between a white man and his woman of color, though not actually legally binding. This situation was assumed to be legalish and acceptable due to its prevalence among men of wealth, influence, status, and or power. It was not uncommon for the children of such relationships to be recognized as free and never used as slaves. Louis Blache was not the prostitute type, but was interested in meeting a young lady to be his concubine. Blache had been married for almost 2 decades, and his wife had never become pregnant, not for lack of trying, and he and his wife were entering into their 40s. Marie, his wife, had no knowledge of Louis' venture to seek a concubine. She was told that he would be traveling to New Orleans, and that was all. She loved her husband, but was never upset when he traveled and left her in charge of the household. Louis owned slaves because he inherited them, and they were, in his opinion, necessary to continue operating the enormous property he inherited. He treated them well and would often be found having jovial conversations with them. Occasionally, Louis could be found helping them work out in the field, tending crops or gathering pecans. Marie, however, enjoyed being bowed down to and almost worshipped. Once, while Louis had gone on one of his trips, Marie walked up to a slave girl of 14 years of age and slapped her across the face. "What are you looking at, you scrawny little thing? Don't you see me? You better stand erect when I pass by, and greet me properly." The girl responded, "Yes'm, Miss Marie." But when Marie had sauntered far enough away, the girl looked down at her younger brother, 10 years old, and said, "That a sad, wrinkled-up old lady." The girl's brother softly nodded his head in agreement, saying, "Mm-hmm," and the two of them went back to digging. The two gentlemen dined together in a small parlor of Thureau's cottage home. To anyone watching from afar, the scene would appear to be slightly humorous. Louis stood over a foot taller than Pierre and had wide, squared shoulders, tapering into a lean waistline. Louis' sandy-colored hair was often oily and stringy, and his face was not handsome, but his lofty physique and his manner of dress were a distraction from it. One could perhaps be led into imagining him to be good-looking based solely on his stature and fine attire. Louis also possessed the warmest of smiles, which he never seemed to be without. Pierre, at 5.5 feet tall, had a boyish face with a dimple on each side and graying at the temples of his curly and otherwise light brown hair. The men sat across the table from each other. Although different physically, agreeable in conversation, speaking of Blanche's parents, times long ago, and how splendid the meal was. Pierre's plaçage, Fanny, was an amazing cook.
My visit is not about catching up on old times, Pierre. It is my belief that Marie cannot provide me with proper heirs.
Pierre pushed back from the table and stared at Blanche for a spell, as though in disbelief, and began. Well, that's not at all what I was expecting. Not at all. When you came alone, I assumed you wanted the company of one of my whores. The two men walked out onto the wrapped porch to continue the conversation that was becoming more interesting by the moment. Louis, what is it that you're asking of me? Without any thought, Louis retorted.
Because of my Catholic faith, moreover, my faithfulness to Marie, I cannot divorce her and remarry. By the same right, bigamy is no option.
He hesitated, but became bolder as the words began to flow.
May I propose that you offer me your daughter, Alona, by the free woman of color, Fanny?
Stunned, Pierre replied.
Oh, Alona is educated. She speaks proper French, proper English, and she learned the language of her Kiramachakin.
Alona's mother, Fanny, had a Native American father with a Haitian mother. Pierre continued. It is my belief that she would be better suited to a true marriage, to someone with whom she can have a legal wedding and make a life with, a free man of color. She already has a suitor calling. He's a fine mulatto gentleman. James Delisle is his name.
With all due respect, Pierre.
Wait, Louis. Alona is colored, but I love my daughter and want more for her than concubineship. Not having a good argument to dispute that point, Louis simply said,
I will give a gentleman's promise to you to keep her to the same standard that I have kept Marie. Once she gives me children, maybe even better.
Louis continued on, sounding more and more convincing and deeply sincere. The two men conversed on the subject for over an hour, until Pierre chuckled at Louis' efforts. I've known you and yours for a long time, and so long that I'm compelled to believe your word. You are continually trustworthy. I have no doubt in my mind that you will keep my daughter well. By design, no money passed between the two white men. Pierre would not allow payment from Louis because Pierre owned a whorehouse and could not live knowing his own daughter was being traded for money. And because his daughter was a woman of color, he did not want Louis to presume ownership of her like that of a slave. Pierre had spoiled his daughter just as many other white men in New Orleans had done with their mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon children of that time. Pierre wanted the best for his daughter and wholeheartedly believed this arrangement to be solid. With that, Pierre Matisse Thureau agreed to send his 17-year-old daughter, Alona, to live on the property of his family friend, Louis Blanche. He instructed Fanny to get their daughter set out for her journey to the Blanche plantation and pecan grove. Alona's tiny, sepia-colored mother dutifully packed a bag and dressed Alona properly for her travels. As soon as she saw her father, "Papa, please don't make me go," Alona shouted with all her might while glaring at her father. "Papa! Papa! Papa!" She continued to scream out, causing her voice to become hoarse, tears mixing with saliva from her mouth, running down her chin and neck until they hid securely under her ruffled collar. "You know I'm being courted by James. You know it, Papa. Please, Papa. I don't know this man, Papa." Alona tensed her body, cried out, and shouted to no avail. Alona remained reluctant and unyielding, even as her first foot was set onto the running board of the coach, the rest of her being dragged up onto the vehicle by her father and Louis. Fanny turned her head away and sobbed silently as Alona lost the battle. The young girl eventually stopped fighting back, as it did her no good. Alona could have known 10 languages, but she spoke no words as she rode. They traveled for miles, Louis talking, with no response from the young girl. She couldn't hold it any longer. "Is your residence near?" Louis, shocked that she had spoken.
No, I can't say it's close.
Alona begrudgingly, and with all the dignity she could muster. "I'll need to relieve myself soon." She had to pee, and now Louis knew it. Laughing inside,
Uh, oh yes, I'll stop here. Is this spot all right with you?
Alona, quiet and smug, said, "Yes, it will do." Louis caught a glimpse of her. This quadroon or quarter black girl was exquisite and striking, to say the least. She stepped off the coach, tangling her foot into a vine on the ground as she walked a few feet away. She stabilized herself, regaining her footing, and told Louis, "Stop looking." He did, but he didn't want to. Even with an angry face on, she was the prettiest thing he had ever seen. A work of art, he thought to himself. Louis had seen the most profound sunsets at dusk and the keenest sunrises at dawn. Yet this girl, in his eyes, topped those magnificent experiences. He grinned to himself and looked away. He was smitten like a teenage schoolboy. "Ah!" Alona let out the loudest, sharpest screech a person could make with human vocal cords. "A snake!" Louis jumped down from the coach and ran to her rescue. After wrestling with and killing the snake, then relieving his own full bladder, he and Alona boarded the coach and began an actual conversation. She was less rigid now, having been embarrassed by her stumbling and pee-pee situations, which also included Louis rescuing her from a snake. After arriving at the grove, it was quite awkward for so many reasons. First of all, Louis had never touched another woman sexually since the start of his marriage. Alona could possibly run away. Marie, his wife, had no idea what Louis had planned, and Louis had not planned sleeping accommodations for his new mistress.
The only place we have for you to rest is this empty slave quarter.
Witnessing an eye roll from Alona, Louis quickly added,
I know you're used to having high quality accommodations, and I promised your father to take good care of you, so I will fix this up for you really nice."
Alona was a free woman, and had always lived in New Orleans, where Papa provided her with fine things. To put it in perspective, she was now being downgraded, and she knew it. Although she didn't know what to expect, this definitely wasn't it. Louis handed Alona one of his 2 kerosene lanterns, and he left the cabin carrying the other. In the dark of night, the young girl, who had never slept in a house alone, could not see how cringeworthy this shack truly was. She knew she was cold, and she knew she longed to see her mama. She wondered what James would think or do when he discovered she was gone forever. They had kept company with each other since she was only 13. Alona scoped out the cramped space and sat in her own silence. She felt suddenly overwhelmed with an ambivalence of emotions. Sure, tears welled in her eyes over James. Of course, she would miss him and would probably long for him over time. She housed that sunken feeling in her stomach over not completing the life she had anticipated, the life that was already set and started. She would miss her conversations with Mama on the front porch in the evenings. Her younger siblings and she would now have to condense their relationships down to pages of letters. Amidst all the introspection and melancholy, Alona was overtaken by a sudden strange warmth that came from within as she waited for Louis to return. This mystifying feeling provided a refreshing lightness in Alona's chest that she couldn't quite decipher. Why was there an inkling of excitement erupting in her heart? From what she could see, the living arrangement didn't look half bad, and Louis promised to fix that. Always the optimist, always the woman of faith in God, Alona felt a calmness in knowing that God makes no mistakes, and He had her where He wanted her. She believed that if she was placed there, it was for a reason, and perhaps something special needed to be birthed through her. Along with the despair from what might have been and the yearning for her family in New Orleans, Alona felt a tiny seed of hope to fulfill her life's purpose. Louis interrupted her thoughts by barging back into the itty-bitty shack.
I brought you some essentials.
He unloaded 2 fleece wool blankets onto the sad, undersized mattress that lay on the floor, placed a water-filled ceramic pitcher and its basin onto the rickety table, and handed her a clean wash rag and chunk of cornbread wrapped in a piece of cloth.
Tomorrow I'll get Samuel to restuff your mattress with fresh straw.
Thank you, Mr. Blash, sir.
You will call me Louis. You will need to be more familiar with me. Do you have full understanding of the agreement between your papa and me?
Yes, sir, Alona responded.
Yes, Louis,
Louis corrected. Yes, Louis, conforming to his wish. With that, the 2 spoke their goodnights, and he left for the main house. Louisiana in 1760, particularly New Orleans, enjoyed a commingling of the races. Free people of color, who had been educated by their white fathers, had acquired land and were in some cases slave owners themselves. At this time, the term Creole in this area referred to people who were born in the colonies but were descended from Europe. White people who descended from Europe called themselves white Creoles, and European descendants, who were also of African and or Native American descent, referred to themselves as black Creoles. Collectively, they referred to themselves as French. Upon waking up that first morning, Alona grasped the pathetic reality that things appear differently in the dark than they do in the full light of day. Sadness draped her eyes, causing the furrowing of her brow. But only for a second. Those same eyes bulged out in surprise when she noticed that the floor had boards that were split, exposing the ground that was only about 2 feet below where she stood. Alona made eye contact with a new friend. She thought it was a squirrel, but she wasn't quite sure because she stopped looking when a chill ran down her spine. The creepiness vexed her whole being. Alona further inspected the dwelling she had convinced herself was so cozy in the dark, and discovered more concerning details. The thatched roof had a couple of unintended air vents. The back door could aptly have been renamed Gate. At the bottom, where the door ought to meet the frame, was a gap of 5 or 6 inches. The top of the door was similar, sporting a gap of about 4 inches from the top of the door frame. Suddenly, all those comfy feelings she felt the night before were null and seemed extremely ridiculous. Alona wanted her mama. "Mr. Blosh, Louis, better get me situated with appropriate lodging soon, or I'll bite him if he comes near me." Alona shouted out loud in her empty cabin with lots of attitude and tenacity, but no one heard this semi-tantrum. Eventually, the two became more acquainted. Late-night visits with long conversations were the precursor to more intimate courting. Blosh knew better than to just come right in and start forcing himself on Alona. He didn't want resistance. His preference was for her to accept him willfully. It worked out in his favor because Alona became the mother of 5 little Blosh children within the first 10 years of their situationship, having birthed 4 boys and 1 girl. They were smart, strong, good-looking children who were well loved by Papa Blosh. Louis was spending so much time with his and Alona's children that he had begun to forget his love for Marie, though he never forgot his commitment to her. Alona, through the eyes of her children, had fallen in some sort of love with Louis. Marie grew more bitter and sad as time passed on, and started turning meaner from year to year. Special watch and care had to be given to the children, since Marie tended to try to harm them on occasion. While they were unsupervised, she would pinch them by squeezing a spot of skin tightly and turning it until they would squeal loudly. The children wore bruises on their upper arms for years before Alona spotted Marie doing this one day and told Louis. The children were dared not to tell, but Alona wasn't. Marie's antics drew Louis further and further away from her. Alona hadn't lived with poor accommodations very long. She earned the status fit for a wife and mother of Blosh's children, although never actually becoming a wife to him. After 20 years, Alona had given birth to 8 children, and each child was formally educated. Upon becoming of age, each of his children was given land by Louis, while he was still alive and well. "You give and give to those bastards of that whore homewrecker. You leave nothing for me," Marie yelled at the top of her voice when Louis and his oldest son were walking past the main house carrying a crate. She continued on with, "Bastard children! They should be my slaves, working to fan this summer heat from my face, or rub my feet, or cook my meals." With the last comment, Marie turned and scowled at Alona's youngest daughter, Carrie Ann, only 5 years old at the time. With the sophistication of a true lady and the empathy she held inside for a lifetime, Alona walked up the steps to the wrapped porch. Something up until then she hadn't realized that she had never done before. Keeping her voice soft and her temper restrained, Alona spoke to Marie face to face for the first time ever. "Mrs. Blash, ma'am, I've come to offer you the biggest apology I can find in my heart. For years, I would cry myself to sleep, knowing you existed and were lonely, feeling like I had done you wrong. My dream in life was not to be a concubine. My education and priming were for me to meet a free man of color who is educated and cultured, my equal, who could take me as his wife, fair and legal. I had one too. The hand I was dealt was that your husband came and got me, a girl of only 17, talking about wanting children. He took me from my papa and promised to provide me a good home and care for my offspring, his offspring. The drawback was that I could never be married. I would always have to know that my babies are bastards, your husband's bastards. I would have to live with the shame on me for hurting you. But you know what, Mrs. Blash? Marie, your behavior toward my innocent daughter just now has negated every bit of remorse I ever felt toward wrecking your marriage. I'm sorry for causing you harm, but I had no real choice in the matter, did I? My daughter deserves an apology from you because it is not her fault that you were barren." No shouting was done, nor was it necessary. Everything that needed to be said was said. Marie looked down her nose and smirked at Alona. She walked passively into the parlor of her home, where she sat alone for the rest of the evening, staring out of the window. 1 year to the day later, Marie died at the age of 61. No lingering or long grueling illness was endured. She just didn't wake up that morning. She continued to clutch the bitterness until the very end, and rightfully so. Carrie Ann never did get that apology, nor did anyone expect it. Louis asked Alona to move into the main house with him, offering to share a different room from the one where Marie and he had once slept. Alona declined and continued to live in the cottage he had built especially for her. Louis also managed to have a Catholic church planted through the archdiocese for Alona on their property. It was named St. Maurice and was frequented by many black Creoles from all across Louisiana. Louis lay ailing for several months before his death. 10 years after Marie died, when Louis lay dying, he called Louis Jr. and Jean-Paul to his bedside and told them, "Free the slaves if you would like, and make sure all the land around the lake stays in the family, and incorporate it together into a town. I love you, my sons. Please take good care of your mother." With that said, Louis Blash closed his eyes for the last time. Louis's mission was accomplished by his own sons. He managed to leave a legacy behind. An incorporated town was birthed through Alona Thoreau. Pecan Grove was that town. Louis, having sought that church, brought many black Creoles from miles around to worship. Over time, some bought property from the Blash family to build houses. The town was based around Creole traditions and was populated by free black people of every shade, mostly light-skinned people with a European, African, and Native American mix. They predominantly shared the same familiar culture that began while the French ruled Louisiana. Alona moved back to New Orleans only months after Louis's death. She maintained a love for Louis that presented itself whenever she gazed affectionately at the faces of their children and grandchildren. She also had a deep appreciation for him for keeping the promise he made to her papa and for treating her and their children so well for all those years. But Alona had still always felt that she was being held on the Blanche plantation against her will. Even though it was now more than just a plantation, her curiosity of what could have been manifested as a gnawing that tore her up. She understood that making the best of something did not mean you were satisfied or happy. Alona's parents were deceased when she returned to New Orleans, but her siblings were all still alive and well. She moved in with her youngest brother and his wife. While living in New Orleans at the age of 48, Alona ran into the man who had been her suitor when Louis came for her so long ago. His name was James, and he was just as polite as she had remembered him to be.
Alona Two Rose, still as lovely as ever. It sure is a true wonder seeing you.
James had been told by a friend where his first love had gone 31 years prior. Alona breathed in a deep breath to avoid shedding a tear and to calm the emotional rush that overtook her innards. James DeLille, you look taller than I remember. The gray stripes in your hair complement your olive complexion. Did you become a physician as you had dreamed?
Yes, I did. Time has not drawn near to you, Alona, appearing still 17, svelte figure, golden skin, and still with that long black silk you call hair framing your gorgeous face.
Dr. DeLille never married. He left the hole in his heart open for only Alona to fill. Learning of his marital status only reassured Alona that she had made the right decision to return to the city. Of course, the two began to court immediately, and it lasted for a few months, as if not one moment had passed by since the relationship of their youth. Alona became the wife of her own husband, her sole true love, James, and they married at St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter of New Orleans, just as she had dreamt most of her nights as a youngster. At that time in history, things were beginning to change. In the Louisiana Territory during that era, there was a way of thinking that was inconsistent with the rest of the colonies. French rule had set a tone that didn't lose its flair when the Spanish had taken charge in the 1760s. This community, which had considered itself French, would be sold to the United States and would now be expected to assimilate their thinking to the ways of the other colonies. In 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase took effect, Creoles, in most cases, spoke French or in some form of broken French. Many of their children had been sent to France for education because the people of color were not legally allowed to be formally educated in the colonies. These people considered themselves, for all practical purposes, French. This would be no more. The friendships and commingling would be forced to cease. White Creoles would need to distinguish themselves as white, and would no longer associate themselves with black Creoles, who were now simply called blacks. Everyone would be American, either white or black. Land, rights, and freedoms were being snatched away from free people of color. Because Louis Blanche protected his children's inheritance by having them form a town, it would be made more difficult for their land to be taken. The community's strength was also reinforced due to so many other free people of color moving to be near the church. Pecan Grove thrived.